Welcome back to A Writer's Mind podcast. I'm Delcherie Gladden. And this week's episode is going to be a little bit different because I didn't really get any writing done last week because I was on vacation. And I think I wrote like 250 words at one point while Chris was getting some work done. But mostly what I focused on last week as we were traveling and driving and having conversations with Chris was figuring out the world and the problems with the story and things that I needed to figure out, basically, and come up with better reasons and increase my own understanding of what it is that I'm writing. So I ended up with a very long list of things that I either need to fix or things that I have figured out, and kind of getting a better idea of what this world is going to be like and how that is going to affect the story. So it added to my list of things that I need to work on and fix, but it also gave me a much better understanding of what I'm working with, where I need to make some changes, and where I'm going to go from here. So the next week of writing is going to be a lot of dual purpose, me correcting certain things and then writing forward based on the stuff I figured out and the things that I'm going to go back and correct or alter or change or whatever. So the main thing that I needed to figure out that I think was holding me up on deciding where to go with the story and how to fix some of the issues that I was encountering, I needed to have a better understanding of the world of the investigators and why they were doing some of the things that they're doing. What were the stakes? Why do they care? Who's in charge of this whole thing? And how is that affecting the humans as they're being investigated? And Chris was super helpful with this. He's really good at helping you work through tangled up thoughts and fix story problems. So part of the time while we were driving, that was one of the conversations we had. And it was super helpful because I was really getting stuck on some things of like, well, I'd had this in mind and this is how I wanted it to go, but it's not quite working. But I was having a hard time stepping back from what I initially wanted the story to be to see what it should be or what made more sense for it to be. I'm going to go through kind of some of the things I figured out. I still have a few questions that I'm kind of working through, and some of this may change depending on how things go, but my initial concept of the investigators was very vague, and I was thinking more about the story of Arya's disappearance and Sage being investigated by Beatrix, and I wasn't sure where those two were interacting in a meaningful way. I didn't have enough depth in the investigators' world to really make this a fully featured world that makes sense and has its own identity. So what I've decided is rather than this being aliens or a world that has come and kind of taken over the operation of the humans or anything like that, them being sort of some outside force, what I'm going to go with is that the investigators and the rest of their society are connected dimension. So they are on Earth, but they are on a different dimensional existence than the humans, but they are connected. There's some crossover with the power. They rely on each other, although the humans have no idea that any of this exists. But the investigators, and I'm still kind of trying to come up with a name for their overall world and society. I'm getting more of the lingo down as far as what people are called and the jobs and their concepts. But I still haven't named them as a whole people, as a world. I'm still thinking about that. Hopefully that'll come to me eventually. But basically, these two dimensions are connected through karmic energy. It flows between the two dimensions. So anything that really disrupts the karmic balance in the human world can cause harmful effects in the investigators' world. So the investigators, there isn't necessarily someone who said, like, this is your job and this is your job. You guys are in charge of keeping the humans in line. They're aware of the karmic energy, and they have kind of taken it upon themselves to step in and deal with things in the human world when it starts affecting the balance between the two worlds. So they are the ones who are identifying cases that need to be investigated. And initially my thought was more these people need to be investigated because the human world was not going to hold them accountable for whatever reason. Like, there just was no clues for human police or whoever to go off of. It was just going to remain unsolved. But I'm shifting more toward this idea of disruptions in the karmic energy hurting the investigators' world, so they need to step in and deal with it. So it's not necessarily anymore like something that would never be discovered otherwise. It's more about preventing harm to the investigators' world, as well as stopping these people who are causing major disruptions from continuing to cause disruptions in the karmic balance. So they're trying to decide what is going on. Is the person that they're investigating, is this like an unusual situation, kind of a one-time thing, things got crazy, or is this person someone that is continually going to be causing problems in the balance of karmic energy? So it's really kind of shifted my concept of the series over the course of however many books this turns out to be, which I didn't see coming. I was kind of focused in on what I initially thought, but I think this is going to add a lot more depth to both worlds and raise the stakes quite a bit for the investigators. They're not just doing this as like, oh yeah, I got a job at the investigation office. This is what I do now. This is more of public service. We're keeping our world alive by managing what's going on in the human world. So higher stakes, more motivation to be involved in these investigations, which would make it more competitive, which brings opportunities for other types of conflict throughout the series as well. So there is more of a tiered structure to this world than I had initially figured out, because initially I was kind of thinking, I had talked about how Beatrix's supervisor was kind of the one putting together the initial information and giving her the dossier on, here's the details of your case. So I had been kind of picturing almost like they're kind of these voyeurs who can see into the human world and observe certain things and gather certain information. But the more I thought about that, it wasn't completely working. I was running into issues of, okay, what could they see? What information could he find? And if he can find that, why can't he find this? And that sort of thing. I'm going to be shifting from it being the supervisor who's putting together the case file and he's still making the decision on whether this is going to be investigated or not, but I added another level there. So the first level of they're going to detect this disruption, this disturbance in the karmic energy, and there's going to be someone who is basically bottom rung of the investigation team. I don't know if I'm going to call him a scout yet or an observer, but basically they're able to cross between the dimensions, but they cannot interact in any way. So this scout or whatever, all they can do is observe. So they're going to go to wherever they're sensing the imbalance, and they're going to try to identify who's causing the imbalance, who else might be involved, and then if they think, okay, yeah, this seems like we've found the source of the problem, then they're going to start gathering that information. Who are the people? Who are their families? Jobs, school, what are their schedules? They're going to gather all that, as much information as they can, that's going to allow an investigator to then step into the suspect's life and not be, flailing around completely like not knowing what's going on, which is in part sometimes what's happened to Beatrix with this because it was arranged so quickly. So I'm going to go back and fix some references with that and some of the internal dialogue and conversations Beatrix has and kind of where her problem lies with Cal. That's going to need some adjusting to account for the fact that someone else is gathering this initial information. So basically, I want this to be kind of a skill-based system. Someone who wants to be an investigator, they're going to start out first as the scout or observer. They're going to learn what human civilization is like, how to interact with it by observation, what matters, what doesn't, and then build these case files. And so if they do that well enough for long enough, they could advance to be an investigator. But they also need to gain some literal skills of working with the karmic energy. The first stage, they're able to cross between the dimensions, but they need to learn how to interact with organic material, whether that's turning a page in a file so they can see what's on the next page and they're not limited to, oh, this book or this file folder is open, I can read that page. I'm still thinking through what'll be some of the limitations on that, or if these scouts are limited to not being able to physically interact with anything up until they complete their work as an observer, then they would go into a training program where they actually learn how to start manipulating organic matter in preparation for inhabiting a human body. So that's one of those things I still need to think about a little bit and decide where those limitations lie. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm leaning toward observers can't interact in any way, but we'll see as I kind of play with that a little bit more. So they're going to be the ones, like I said, they're gaining all the initial information, and then that file is going to be passed on to the investigator before they go down and actually inhabit the body. And the supervisor is still going to be the one who assigns the investigator to particular cases, which comes back to some conflict between Cal and Beatrix. Some other things that we figured out is what happens to investigators who are either unsuccessful or who their suspect dies before they finish their investigation and make that judgment on where they should go. There's going to be a 3-tiered option basically on judgment. So if they come in and they decide like either this was a one-time thing and this person not going to be a problem moving forward, they're allowed to continue living during that lifetime, and then they'll move on and be reincarnated to live another life. And basically, this is a world, or not necessarily a spiritual sense of reincarnation, but more of a learning process in this existence, trying to reach that point of balance, where humans learn that they need to balance those priorities between self, others, nature, all of that. So this is a world that has reincarnation. So if a person is judged that they can continue living, they will do so to their whatever their natural lifespan was going to be, and then they'll be reincarnated with a second chance. But they'll kind of be marked as somebody to watch when they are reborn, to see maybe we need to keep an eye on this person just in case they are a continuing problem. But for those who are determined that they're going to continue causing problems in this world, they will have that current life ended in some way. I'll get into that in a minute. And then they're sent to, I think I'm going to stick with Chris's suggestion and go into like a re-education program of just trying to, like, you're not learning the lessons you're supposed to learn as a human. So we're going to more forcefully try to teach you those things. And then they're held there in that re-education program until somebody, whoever's in charge of that, deems, okay, they're ready to try again. We're going to give them another chance, basically. And I'm thinking kind of like a person who's investigated gets marked. There may be some sort of like, I don't know, 3 strikes you're out policy or something where it's like, okay, this is the 3rd time we've had to send someone to investigate all the karmic disruption you're causing. Yeah, we're done. We're done with you because you obviously are incapable of learning what you should and shouldn't be doing and how you should live and interact with other people in the world around you. So I guess that is kind of a 4th option, that they can just end that process of reincarnation. Basically, they used up all their chances. None of the efforts are helping, and they're putting both worlds in danger, so they're not going to be allowed to continue. And then there's one other option where the suspect dies. Usually this is going to be like an accidental death or a health issue death, something like that. Something outside the investigator's control, where the suspect dies before the investigation was completed. So there's not a determination yet on whether they should be re-educated or allowed to be reincarnated. They're going to go to kind of like a purgatory place. I may come up with a different name for that, but they're going to be held there. And there is a risk that the investigators take when they inhabit these human bodies, that if they do not get out of the human body, either because of a natural or accidental death, or whatever plan they set in motion to end the life of someone who's going to be sent to re-education, I don't know, maybe something goes wrong and they don't leave the body before, they get stuck with their suspect soul in whatever place they are sent. So to re-education or to purgatory or whatever, they're kind of attached to that soul, and they're not going to be able to leave until someone else steps in and completes the investigation. And so this kind of gives a whole other depth to the story. This was one, I think Chris suggested this, and I really like it, so we're going to incorporate it. So where I think we can use that to make this story more interesting and make Beatrix and Cal's relationship problems as supervisor and investigator add some more depth to that is that Beatrix is in Sage's body and she's investigating Sage, but part of the very hasty addition of Beatrix to this case is because Arya was the one who was being investigated first, and she disappeared, died, along with the investigator who was in her body midway through the investigation. So very quickly, Beatrix is pulled in by Cal, and I'll get into their conflict a little bit more in a minute, but Beatrix is pulled in by Cal, sent down into Sage's body to continue the investigation and figure out what's really going on, what happened with Arya, so they can rescue or release the other investigator who was originally in Arya's body. So I think that's going to add a lot. That's also going to add a lot of things I need to go back and change in those first 12 chapters, which is fine because I think that's going to really improve the story and add a lot to it. And that gives me some good ideas on where we're going to go with the story moving forward. So this adds also to, like I said, that conflict between Cal and Beatrix because he has a habit of assigning her these types of cases because he is trying to get rid of her. And I swear there was something else Chris and I talked about kind of an initial reason for why he dislikes her so much. And I can't remember what it was. So I have a note for myself with a question mark. I'll see if he remembers later. We'll talk about that, hopefully figured out. But basically, a big part of their current hatred of each other is because he keeps assigning her these very time-limited cases because he would like her to get stuck in purgatory or whatever and then be out of his hair, and then he can kind of take his time or assign a not-so-good investigator to wrap up her case so she's gone and kind of trapped in wherever for longer. So I think that'll be an interesting thing to play with, and that gives me some ideas for future books where Beatrix potentially does get trapped somewhere and then has to try to continue her case or find some way to interact with whoever the new investigator is to get them on the right track, because Cal would most likely have assigned someone who's really terrible that's going to prolong her being trapped. So, like I said, I think that's going to add a lot more depth, having a better understanding of how this whole process works, and give me some other future conflicts to work with as well to really just add to this. That takes us up to who exactly are these investigators? What are they made out of? Because they are non-corporeal, and they always have been. I kind of played with the idea of like, oh, maybe they're humans who have reached an equivalent of maybe enlightenment, that they're perfect. They've gone through this process of reincarnation. But then that wasn't really going to work because Cal wouldn't be such a jerk if he had reached some stage of enlightenment. They would all just be really great, altruistic, super helpful people in their society. And that would be kind of a boring society. I'm going to go not with them having been human before. They are just always whatever I decide to call them. Still haven't figured that out. But they are basically just energy. I'm still on the fence of whether they're some kind of soul as well, or if they are some sort of condensed karmic energy that has intelligence, has sense of self and identity. And then I'm also like, well, how would that be different than a soul? So some kind of soul-like entity, but different than a human soul. So still working on that one, still playing with that idea of exactly who they are, because there's no god entity that I want to bring in at this point. Just kind of this role of the investigators' world, people there, they have the ability and understanding to see and interact with karmic energy. And so they're doing what they can to keep human cruelty and stupidity and all of those things that we're known for as humans from destroying both of the worlds. So it really benefits both of them, but it's kind of a one-sided effort because the humans don't know any of this stuff exists. I'm going to leave kind of a god type figure out of it and just go with that for now. It may change in the future, we'll see. But some of the other things that are going to be incorporated into this world because they can sense and see the disruptions, somebody needs to be available to keep an eye on things. So we'll have some sort of monitors, people who watch and look for anomalies in the karmic energy and disruptions and point out like, hey, I think we need to send someone over here to see what's going on. So that'll be another area of making this more of a society rather than just a couple random characters that we don't know much about on that side of things. And I think that will kind of grow as I think about it more and develop into like a full-on society with more structure and all of that. One of the other things that I had been kind of going back and forth on, if once the investigation is completed, when does that judgment go into effect? And it's a little bit different with this first book because I'm starting out with Sage's character having some other aspects going on that are causing the short timeline. I'll get into what that is a little bit later once I get to it in the actual writing. But normally, not every suspect is like on the verge of dying. So if they're not going to die naturally soon, what do the investigators do once they've made their decisions and said, like, yes, this person's going to continue to cause problems? Do they get to finish out their natural life, which wouldn't really make sense if their goal is to keep the balance, which Chris pointed out when I was kind of trying to verbally work through some thoughts on that. But I think I'm going to have them where the investigators need to make it look like something natural or accidental has happened. Once they make that determination and it's approved by the supervisor, they need to come up with some way that causes the suspect to die, but that doesn't trap them with their spirit. So something that they're going to have to plan out that will ensure the death of the subject, but give them time to escape whatever thing that they set in motion. So I'll have to think about what some of the tactics are on that, and it would be something that they would be trained to do before coming down to be an investigator, and kind of exploring what that does to the investigators on a psychological and emotional level, because they've been living this person's life, and as Beatrix kind of mentioned in the chapter with the little brother Lyndon, she kind of has that moment of like, whatever happens here, there's negative effects on the people around Sage who love her and care about her, and that's a hard thing for her at times. So again, it kind of just adds that other layer of reality to the world, but also depth of worldview and emotion and connection to the other characters and to these two worlds at large, and trying to figure out, their place in it. And this is how their world works. Is that the best way? What are her thoughts and feelings on that, and how that might change over time? Because that would be a difficult thing to deal with. And just because they're not physical humans doesn't mean that they don't have those same struggles of working through the emotional and psychological trauma of the job that they do. So I'll continue to keep that in mind and kind of think through how that's going to affect the characters over the long term of the story. So we've got the last thing that I kind of was thinking about is basically what happens when they do encounter the investigators, when they have a case where it's been basically like a repeat offender, where they've tried re-education, they've given them multiple chances, and they keep coming back and being a problem. And they kind of reach that limit of, that's it, we're not giving you any more chances. And I think that this is going to link back to why the investigators can't just look at the suspect's memories, why they can't just directly interact with them. I'm still thinking through like all the limitations and rules associated with this, but basically these investigators, they're learning how to interact with the physical world, but interacting with a soul is much different. Physical things, like a book, even a cat, and the human body, which the human body in this world without the soul is just organic compounds. So they can inhabit the human body, but they can't actually do anything to the soul other than put it in this trap that they've come up with. So they bind the soul up into the little ball that I've talked about, where Sage, as the one being inhabited, is aware of what's happening, and her emotions can pass through the binding, but none of her thoughts. She can't directly talk to or interact with Beatrix. And what I'm still working through and deciding. Basically, there are some limitations on these energies fully interacting with each other that causes dangerous, destructive potential. So a soul from the investigator's dimension can come over, inhabit a body, and take it over, and they can interact on a physical level with the world around them. But if they try to alter or interact with the energy involved in a soul, that's very different. And that basically, if they try to manipulate or change or directly interact with a soul, it starts to pull it apart. And there's a risk for the investigator of the same thing happening to their soul. So it has to be like a very careful, skilled process. Like they would bring in someone very experienced, specially trained to look at a case where it's like, okay, this is, the fourth or fifth or sixth, however many times they're going to give them, that we've had to come down and deal with this one particular soul. It would be someone specially trained to then, once they make that decision and it's approved, to basically pull apart this soul that they feel like cannot be re-educated, and it destroys the soul and disperses it into the karmic ether. And then that's it. Like no more reincarnation for them. Their identity and sense of self is completely gone. It's ripped apart and basically end of the line for them. So I think this is how I'm going to answer my earlier question of needing a better reason for why Beatrix can't just come down, inhabit Sage's body, look at all her memories and be like, oh yeah, okay, that's what happened. And then, end of case, basically. So that, like I said, that will not only not be a very interesting mystery, but it would not really make sense for this to be happening. They wouldn't need this whole process of investigation if they could just pop into someone's head, be like, oh, yep, you are a horrible person who's never going to learn anything. Poof, we just destroyed your soul. There needs to be a reason that doesn't happen. And basically, I'm going to go down this route of still figuring out kind of the details, but two souls interacting with each other directly really screws up the karmic energy and causes kind of this backlash where potentially it could destroy both of the souls. But for someone who is experienced enough in this act of pulling apart a soul, they can do that without also destroying themselves most of the time. But it's way too dangerous for anyone else to try to accomplish this, which sets those barriers in place for what they can learn directly from the subject and what they have to learn through investigation. So that's kind of as far as I've come on figuring out what the investigator's world is like and how it's going to impact these investigations that I'm writing, for this book especially, and then kind of in the future, what that sets up for in future stories. So this kind of adds to the list of things that I need to go back and work on and correct and fix to improve the early chapters of the story. So I'm going to have to go back and redo some of the interactions between Beatrix and Cal and some of her complaints about him to adjust for how I'm restructuring this world. Also going to need to bring in the fact that Arya was being investigated first. And then I think I'm just going to have to be more specific and say that the investigators know she's dead because their investigator disappeared. If she were just missing still, they would know, they'd be able to contact the investigator. So I was kind of leaving that a little bit vague of like, are they investigating a death or a disappearance? But I think I'm going to have to just be more specific here and just, the humans still don't know what happened to Arya, but Beatrix is going to know she's dead because the investigator has disappeared. So I'm going to have to work that in. That's going to change some of the conversations and internal dialogue of Beatrix and having her acknowledge that the stakes are not just determining what was happening, but also she has the motivation to solve this and figure it all out so they can hopefully release their other investigator who's now stuck in whatever place Arya ended up in. I feel like I might need to come up with a better word than purgatory, but that's the easiest thing that comes to mind right now, so I'll think about it some more. So she's got this other goal, and then I'm going to need to work into her thoughts and her motivations as well. Redo some of the mentions of the conflict between Cal and Beatrix, having her be aware that he's basically trying to get rid of her See if Chris remembers exactly why. We talked about how that feud basically started. Hopefully it'll come to me, or hopefully he remembers. Should have written it down in my notes on my phone. I just didn't have any pen and paper to write things down with at the time because we were in the car. And then kind of just readjusting plans for moving forward, because this does add some other elements that I'm going to need to take into account as I'm writing the next few chapters, particularly because things are starting to get to the point where more information's coming out. Those connections are going to start being made, and Beatrix, with the help of Sarah, are going to start piecing some of these things together a little bit more and trying to figure out, well, they have kind of conflicting goals where Sarah just wants to know what happened to Arya, where she's at, and Beatrix needing to go well beyond that to determine the bigger picture. And I think I need to go back and add more to the story of what was going on with Arya that really causes a bigger disruption in karma. Because, like I said, initially my thoughts were that they investigated things that weren't going to be dealt with through human justice. But now I've shifted that concept to the disruption of the karmic energy being the threat. They don't necessarily care that Sage and or Arya or whoever is involved, Leon, they don't necessarily care that they were going to escape punishment for these crappy things that they were doing. They don't care about that. They care about the world's not imploding because karma it got all over the place and crazy. So the goals of the investigation are different. And as I was thinking about these changes and where I'm going to go forward, also backward though, I don't think this necessarily would have been a big enough karmic disruption to have gotten their attention. So I think I need to add more layers to what was going on of the people affected and figure out how whatever this backstory is was really going to harm and is harming a lot of people. Because they're not going to investigate every time someone's murdered, every time a girl disappears, every time there's partner violence. That would just be way too much. Like they don't have that many investigators to investigate every crappy crime committed human to human. So I think I need to make this situation worse than I initially had it, because I don't think it's a big enough problem that the karmic energy would have sent up an alert, basically, of things are getting bad here. Like someone needs to come figure out what's going on. And not that in reality, a young woman going missing and possibly having been murdered, yes, that is a horrible situation, but not world ending in this fictional realm. So I think I need to think about how I can increase the damage caused by the underlying issues that led to Arya's death and disappearance. Enough people being affected, or even a handful of people but being very deeply affected, needs to come into play for this to have been something that caught the investigators' attention to begin with. So I'm going to be thinking about that specifically as well. How can I add more conflict and potential damage and trauma to the backstory here in order to make it worthy of the investigators stepping in? So kind of playing around with that in my mind, not entirely sure what I'm going to add to this quite yet. I think I just need to investigate ways to have this be more complex and make sure it doesn't just have a simple answer of they had a fight and she got pushed down and smacked her head on a rock or whatever. That's not going to be, like I said, a big enough deal for the karmic investigators to have cared and sent now not one but two investigators to come figure out what is going on here. So yeah, that's where I'm going to paused for this week's episode. I said not really a whole lot of actual writing done because I was out of town and traveling, but a lot of planning and thinking and trying to figure out some answers. So this week I can actually get some good writing in, get some stuff accomplished, and come back hopefully with a stronger story. I will be back next week to let you know how these additions and new chapters hopefully have come together, and hopefully improved the story, made it a lot more interesting and cohesive, and set me on a path to get things wrapped up in an interesting way. So thank you for listening. If you want to learn more about my other books that are actually completed and other random things that I'm working on, classes I teach and whatnot, you can find me at delsheriegladden.com. And the theme music for the show is by Mon Plaisir. Thanks for listening.